Millions of people who thought they might be due for compensation for their car loans may not get it now after a ruling today by the Supreme Court in the UK. But this could be good news for the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. We'll explain why on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and shortly I'll be joined by our Deputy Economics Editor, Dharshini David, because today, the 1st of August, was a big day for Donald Trump's tariffs. And so I want to catch up and find out what's actually happened, because there's been so many twists and turns to that. But first of all, we're going to talk about a British financial story, because this afternoon, the Supreme Court ruled on this big story that's been brewing for a few years now about car finance loans. And so basically, the claim was that car dealers had been working with the financial firms that provided the loans. And basically, the financial firms were letting the car dealers set their own interest rates and then allowing them to earn quite a lot of commission off the higher rates. And so this was uncovered a few years ago. It was then banned as a practice by the regulators. But there's been a series of court cases just trying to work out how much compensation the banks could be on the hook for to compensate the customers who basically were paying too much interest on their car loans as a result. And it ended up in the Supreme Court, so the highest court in the land. And the Supreme Court issued their ruling quite strangely at 4:30 this afternoon on Friday. So let's find out what this is all about and actually what the Supreme Court has decided, because we're joined by two people who've spent many, many years following every twist and turn of this story. Here in the studio is the BBC's international business correspondent, Theo Leggett. Hello, Theo.
Hello.
And also joining us on the line from Westminster is political correspondent Helen Catt, who also presented an excellent episode of File on 4 about this very issue. Hello, Helen.
Hello.
And happy birthday.
Thank you.
I got Donald Trump's tariffs on my birthday. You get the Supreme Court ruling on yours. Theo, before we talk about the actual ruling today, which is quite significant, let's do a bit of backstory. So what are the car finance companies, the banks and the car dealers accused of sort of doing wrong when it comes to the consumer here?
They're accused of concealing from car buyers the fact that when they take out a car finance agreement, and let's not forget that most cars are bought on finance agreements today, that a commission is paid by the lender to the car dealer. Now, this is pretty commonplace, but what the cases we're looking at the moment consider is cases in which relatively unsophisticated consumers, that's the legal expression.
You're not dissing them.
I'm not dissing them, but this is what the legal papers say. Unsophisticated consumers have been offered credit agreements in which there is a built-in commission paid by the lender to the dealer, but the customer doesn't know about it. That's one part of it. Another part of it is whether these commissions are fair, whether they're set at the right level. But all of this came down to 3 test cases, which were heard initially in county court. They were rejected or partly rejected. Later in the appeals court, where the appeals court basically upheld all the consumer complaints and then progressed to the Supreme Court because everybody was crying out for some legal certainty and because the appeal court ruling appeared to have opened the floodgates for an absolute torrent of compensation claims, which would have been great news for consumers who thought they had a claim, but would have been much less good news for lenders.
And we'll come on to that in a second, and we'll talk about the Supreme Court in a second as well. But Helen, listening back to your File on 4 again this afternoon, it was amazing just how this sort of dribbled out over years, these practices.
Yeah, it was. And we look at one particular practice, actually, in the File on 4, which has already been banned, this idea of discretionary commission arrangements. And these were banned back in 2021, but they'd been in operation for a lot of years previously. And what they were was that a car dealer was allowed by the lender, when they were selling a loan to someone to buy a car, to set the interest rate, set the APR overall, and basically that the higher a rate they could get a customer to pay, the more commission they would get. And so that went on for a number of years. It was eventually banned by the regulator, but we spoke to a guy who's a former city trader. He does a lot of trying to raise awareness of practices in the industry, who tried to raise this from about sort of 2015, 2016 onwards. So it was happening for quite a while.
And yeah, I mean, it's been the people that you spoke to who first noticed it. It took them a long time to then even convince the authorities to investigate it, the Financial Conduct Authority to get involved.
Well, yeah, the Financial Conduct Authority says that, look, it took them time to do this investigation, that it was on their radar in sort of 2016, but it took them time to gather the evidence, if you like, to then bring in a ban. But certainly there are lots of questions that are asked by across the industry and by consumer groups about why it took them quite so long to step in and ban this.
And Theo, in the meantime, a huge industry setup of companies and lawyers saying, oh, we will help you claim on if you think that you've been overcharged for the commission on these loans when you got your last car. And you could see the adverts popping up on Instagram and hear them all over the place.
Absolutely. When you get a legal question like this, where there is potential for consumers to get compensation, the claims management companies rush in headlong. And that's not always a good thing for consumers, actually. Yes, it gets everything into the public eye and means people are more aware of what's going on. But also people can be sort of dragged into a situation where they may end up losing a chunk of the compensation they get because these companies charge quite high fees. And in the case of large-scale consumer cases, sometimes the Financial Conduct Authority will set up a central redress scheme, as it still may do with those discretionary commission agreements that Helen was talking about. And that would be free. So it's not always a great thing if people sign up with claims management companies when they could get their compensation without any of the fees being knocked off.
And Theo, you were talking about the potential avalanche of claims here. And it's amazing when you see the estimates of what the biggest case scenario would be, like £30 billion, £40 billion, £50 billion in total. But that scenario has been avoided today because of what the Supreme Court has ruled.
Yeah, that scenario has receded. And the appeal court's ruling basically suggested that if a commission had been paid from the lender to the dealer and you didn't know about it, then you had a valid claim. And that the dealer had a duty of loyalty towards the customer. Now, if you are as old as I am and you used to watch Minder and television programs about car dealers, you would never say
90s drama.
Used car dealers had the customer's interest front and foremost. But this is what the judges suggested, that the car dealers had an absolute loyalty towards the customer and therefore should be trying to seek out the best deal for them. Now, in the Supreme Court ruling, that's been set aside. The judges decided that no, the car dealer was a businessman who would naturally be acting in his own interests and didn't have a selfless duty towards the customer. So that idea has gone out, and the idea that you have to know about the commission being paid, and if not, you have a claim, that seems to have gone out as well. What's been kept in one of the three cases we saw, the court upheld the car buyer's claim because the commission arrangements in that case were deeply unfair. This was a chap who'd been, I wouldn't say coerced, but encouraged to buy a car for a higher price than it was worth, considerably higher. And also the commission on the finance deals he'd had to take out, and he had to take out two, were very significant. And the court decided that this was unfair because the commission was so high, and also because it had been suggested to him that this was the result of looking at lots of options for finance and choosing the best one for his individual circumstances, when in fact the dealer had an arrangement with a finance company and had simply picked that possible deal. So that was unfair. He was entitled to compensation. And so that does open the door for people in the most egregious cases where the commission payments are very high or there's something else that's underhand going on to claim compensation.
In other words, Helen, potentially millions of people could get compensation as a result of this, but not the tens of millions of people that could have got it if the Supreme Court had said yes to absolutely everything.
Yeah, and that was the Treasury's massive nightmare scenario. And just to give you a bit of a sense of what the impact could have been of that, the Treasury was so concerned about that it did actually try to intervene in the Supreme Court case earlier this year. It put in an application, and we heard the judge today say that had been denied because the Treasury was putting forward economic considerations rather than legal ones. But what the Treasury were worried about was that they were concerned that payments on that scale, if it was running into the tens of billions, could reduce firms' ability to keep lending, to keep the market going. They were also worried that it would make the UK look like a sort of not straightforward place to do business, and that would put investors off because they would perceive that the rules were changing. So there had been a lot of concern about it, and there'd even been some reporting to suggest that Rachel Reeves had been considering legislating, if the judgment had gone the other way, to overturn that or to limit payouts. And certainly in this submission that they put into the Supreme Court, it does say that they did not want or do not want consumers to come out of this with basically windfall payments. They want them to be proportionate. So that was the nightmare scenario, which has now, because of today's ruling, gone away. There will still be that hit that you talked about on the banks from things like the discretionary commission arrangements, but it isn't going to run into that enormous hit that the Treasury was worried about. And of course, that does also take some of the political pressure off Rachel Reeves, because in the scenario where it had been that massive hit, there would have been a bit of pressure on her to step in and take those sort of steps, that action. And that, of course, would have risked looking like the government was siding with the big banks over the consumer. So politically, not a great look.
So, Theo, this wasn't just a story about lots of people being affected by something or the banks having to pay out lots of compensation. It was about a sort of systemic risk to the entire British economy, at least as far as the Treasury saw it.
Absolutely. Some of the lenders involved could have been liable for hundreds of millions or even billions of pounds worth of compensation payments. And that could have put some of them out of business. It could have made it harder for people to get finance because those companies would have had to restrict their lending, all that sort of thing. What we have now is a situation in which the compensation bill is unlikely to be 30, 40, 50 billion, but it could still be in the billions. I've seen claims it could be up to 10 billion still. So it's a sizable hit, but it's not that kind of massive systemic hit that would have put people out of business. It's not going to be in the same league as the payment protection insurance scandal we saw a few years ago, for example, but it will be something that lenders won't want. So while they'll be breathing a collective sigh of relief about this, I don't think we'll see any champagne corks popping.
And also, Theo, I mean, I had my lunch outside the Supreme Court today because I was doing my other Radio 4 programme at Westminster. So Helen, wished her a happy birthday. And I was sat outside the Supreme Court and I thought, normally a story like this judgment would have come out in the morning and I'd be sitting outside the Supreme Court after it happened. But actually, this judgment came out at the end of the afternoon. Why did it play out so strangely?
It did come out in the end of the afternoon, and that's not great for journalists when they have
doing the 6 o'clock
bulletins, as you well know. The reason it came out was because of potential impacts on the financial markets. So, if it had come out earlier in the day, the court had been advised that the impact on the market could be substantial, whereas bringing it out after the markets have closed, that gives everybody the whole weekend to look over the judgment, interpret it, examine what the consequences are going to be, and the market's reaction on Monday morning, if there is one, is likely to be considerably more muted.
Oh, and there's a statement from the Financial Conduct Authority that says they welcome the clarification from the Supreme Court. And then they say, we'll confirm whether we will consult on a redress scheme before markets open on Monday, the 4th of August. And that'll be, of course, at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. They say our aims remain to ensure that consumers are fairly compensated and that the motor finance market works well, given around 2 million people rely on it every year to buy a car. So, Helen, this story's not finished. We have to tune in on Monday morning to see what kind of big scale thing the FCA offer as a result of this.
Yeah, absolutely. To see if they are going to come up with this compensation scheme, and if so, who might qualify, and whether it will be, some of the talk has been, well, it could be, if it does happen, automatic, so that people wouldn't actually have to register a claim, that it might be on the lenders to go back and see who they've sold an arrangement to that was under this sort of discretionary commission scheme. So there's a lot of detail still to be worked out. We also don't know, exactly what the Treasury thinks or is planning to do. They've put out a statement this evening saying they respect the judgment from the Supreme Court and will now work with the regulators and industry to understand the impact for both firms and consumers. And they are already, they say, making changes, reforms to some of the things that they say will deliver a more consistent and predictable regulatory environment for businesses and consumers, while ensuring that products are sold to customers fairly and clearly. Because the other context to this is that as part of the Chancellor's real push to try and boost economic growth, part of that is about simplifying regulation and making it easier for companies to invest and to grow. So this does all sort of feed into that wider political context and what the Chancellor's trying to do.
So Theo, newscasters listening to this at home, or maybe listening to this in their car that they bought 4 years ago on finance, when will they know whether they might be eligible for compensation or not? Is it Monday morning?
That's not clear at the moment, but it's likely to be focused on people who took out those discretionary commission agreements that Helen was talking about, because those are the most egregious. You know, dealers were basically being paid to push up the interest rates they were paying.
And would you have known that was one that you were signing up to?
No.
No, yeah, because it was secret between the dealer and the financiers.
Because you were just presented with an APR or an interest rate. You didn't know that potentially the lender would have lent to you for less. That's sort of the crux of it.
So basically, you just have to wait and see what this redress scheme is, and then it will look into your own circumstances. So you can't know today if you're going to get compensation.
I mean, some people will already know, because there have been, for example, Martin Lewis, the money saving expert. He had a form on his website that people could download and send off to lenders that they had contracts with and ask them, basically. Right. So some people will know that already. Others obviously won't be aware.
And we should clarify, Theo, this is a historic thing, because as Helen was saying earlier on, this practice has been banned for a little while now. So when you go and buy a car now and you get it on finance and you get a loan, can you trust that system?
You should be able to trust that system, or at least you'll know that discretionary commission agreements are not in force anymore because they were banned by the FCA back in 2021. So now, in theory, you should be offered a fair interest rate and a fair APR on the loan that you're taking out, but it's always worth reading the small print. You know, some of the people who were making claims in this, they weren't even arguing necessarily that the commission payments were secret. The commission payments were somewhere in the small print, but they didn't read that small print. So, you know, the best thing to do if you're taking out a finance agreement is say, what commission are you being paid?
And Helen, do you want to leave us with one last bit of advice?
Yeah, the advice at the moment is, look, sit tight, wait and see if you think you might have had one of these arrangements. Don't sort of rush off and sign up to something. Just wait and see for a bit.
Helen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Theo, thanks to you too.
Thank you.
Now we're going to talk about Donald Trump's trade tariffs, those import taxes that he slapped on all sorts of countries sending goods to the USA. This is a story that started on the 2nd of April, but today, the 1st of August, when we're recording this episode of Newscast, was another big milestone in that saga. Here to explain is the BBC's Deputy Economics Editor, Dharshini David, who's been covering this story since the very, very early hours of Friday morning. Hello, Dharshini.
Hello, Adam.
Right. I'm a bit confused about where we've got to with tariffs. So
You're not alone.
And you're never meant to say that on the news, but just I am. So what was the deadline today? What was the world aiming for, or at least Donald Trump aiming for the world?
What was Donald Trump aiming for? Some people are calling this Liberation Day number 3, because you remember Liberation Day. Cast your mind back to April.
2nd of April, my birthday.
Your birthday. Oh, well, there you go. And what did you get for your birthday?
Loads of tariffs levied on all global trade.
Exactly what you wanted, in other words, right? So you had Donald Trump. I'm sorry, there was no cake, but he did have that scorecard, remember, in the Rose Garden. And then there was sort of deadline after deadline saying, you know, if you come up with some concessions, if you come up with some arrangements which benefit America, then we'll rethink those. And the latest deadline that was imposed for most countries was the 1st of August. And when we say 1st of August, it was midnight Eastern time in the US, so early hours in the UK. And if you hadn't agreed some kind of agreement by then, there were revised tariffs that were brought out. So we've had another, roughly, I think it's about 70 countries in total have got an announcement of tariffs, some of which are higher, some of which are lower than they previously thought they were going to be. And guess what? There's another week for most until they come in. So things could change again, Adam. Don't get too comfortable.
Yeah, and so you look on the BBC News website and it's a bit like a bingo card where you've got like the different tariff rates and that apply to each country. So in the 10% band, you've got the UK and the Falkland Islands. In the 15% band, you've got places like Afghanistan, Angola, Nigeria, Vanuatu, Zambia. Nicaragua's on 18%. 90% for Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippines, 20% for some, 25% for others, 30% for Algeria, 35% for Iraq, 39% for Switzerland, 40% for Myanmar, 41% for Syria. So it's a real kind of mixed bag.
It's a real mixed bag. You forgot the penguins in there.
Oh, yeah, that penguin territory where there's no actual people or trade. Yeah.
No, they got 10%, by the way, in case anybody was worried. So some beings are celebrating at the moment.
And so in terms of the deals that these countries have done, I'm guessing that there are different kinds of deals that have led to different tariff rates.
Well, it's quite. Let's go through this step by step, because you will know obviously that the UK was the first to come out with an arrangement with the US. It's a long way from a free trade deal, of course, and then EU, Japan, others have followed, right? And the UK got 10%, and at the time we went 10%. That's a bit unfair. But the thing that worried Donald Trump was the size of America's deficit with other countries. We were broadly in balance, but that 10% has looked quite sort of easygoing compared with some of the others. 15% seemed to be the baseline if you were able to agree an arrangement, a deal with Donald Trump. But then there was a few dozen countries left over who hadn't got a deal over the line by the 1st of August. Some of those, not because they hadn't been trying, but quite frankly, they'd not been prioritised by the White House because they weren't such major trading partners. So in actual fact,
because this was a big bureaucratic exercise just to deliver it.
Massive. I mean, you know how this works. It takes years to arrange a trade deal. But what was interesting is that even by last night's deadline, we had a situation whereby the majority of imports entering the US, we already knew what the tariff would be because those deals had been struck with the biggest trading partners, apart from China. And also various letters had gone out to other countries saying, look, this is already the tariff you're going to pay.
Because you have to look at the intensity of the trade between each country and America, because some countries export loads. And so even a small increase in the tariffs is a big deal. And some countries could have huge tariffs, but because their trade's not very big, it's less of a problem.
It absolutely is. So India is a prime example for that because, a couple of days ago, people were going, wow, 25% plus is what India may face. And all of this is a perhaps, who knows whether we'll get another round of this again. But in actual fact, less than 2% of India's GDP relies on American demand. So the impact on on Indian growth there may not be quite so severe. By contrast, Germany, of course, car makers there, means that it's particularly vulnerable to that 15% baseline tariff. So it's going to suffer perhaps a bigger knock to its economic growth.
And so basically it's on a country by country basis, but then there's just actual exceptions even to that. So Canada's getting treated differently. Mexico got a sort of stay of execution for another week. China, the tariffs went way up and then came back a bit for kind of political reasons. Brazil is also in a different category as well.
Brazil is in an extraordinary category. And I think what this tells you is that some of the deals we've seen struck are about what economic benefit you can be to the US. So those countries which are able to say, we'll invest more in the US, we'll buy more American energy, whatever. But then you've got those where Donald Trump is doing something which hasn't really been done before, which is using trade policy, weaponizing tariffs as a tool of foreign policy to try and get what he wants in other areas. We saw it, of course, with Canada, when Canada saying we might recognise Palestine as its own state, and Trump going, I don't like this. Here, 35%. By the way, the 35% actually only applies to a minority of Canada's goods going into the US, but still, it's not a particularly nice place to be if you're Canada. And equally, when it came to India, there was this complaint up front on Truth Social saying, I'm not happy. India has been supporting Russia by buying Russian energy and its relationship with Russia when it comes to weapons. And that, again, is quite a departure for a major foreign leader to do that with trade policy. But having realised how he can weaponise tariffs in particular, he seems to have got rather trigger happy with this.
Is it making him or making the US government loads of money? Because that was also one of the other objectives here.
It was. And, obviously, this tariff regime has yet to come into full force. It is not quite as extreme as he was proposing in April. And, on the one hand, he's saying, I want to bring jobs back to America. I want to get production back to America, which basically relies on Americans buying fewer foreign-made goods. If they're buying fewer foreign-made goods, you're not getting in as much tariff revenue as you might have expected. So what I'm saying is you can't have it both ways. Chances are he will get more money through tariff revenue, not enough to replace a major tax.
I've noticed the stock markets around the world kind of tumbling today, but are they tumbling by as much as they have done in previous episodes of this tariff saga?
It's a very different picture today. Yes, I mean, one thing that is similar is that if you look at the aftermath of both announcements, you're going to see red on the major markets. But the degree is different, the context is different, the mood is different. You're seeing relatively small falls this time around so far, and we are seeing those falls after a period of extreme buoyancy for shares on both sides of the Atlantic, right? There's been some optimism there. So in actual fact, you're looking at a far more relaxed picture. And there is a good reason for that. And that is because these tariffs are not as aggressive as we previously feared they were going to be. The impact on the global economy is unlikely to be as marked. But also, the uncertainty factor has been disappearing as more and more of this comes in, right? At least we know what the baseline is likely to be. Things are not likely to get worse than this. But on the other hand, there is still this feeling there are things to be sorted out. Pharmaceuticals, we still don't quite know what's going to
which is a
happen
whole
there.
different category that are going to get treated differently.
Yeah. So there's concerns there about what President Trump is demanding, and there are concerns too about what could happen with China. So you've still got that underlying mood of unease there. But certainly we have come a long way from those hugely volatile rollercoaster days of April.
Also, so the first thing everyone learns about tariffs is that the importing country government collects the revenue. The second thing you learn is that the people paying the tariffs, so the importing companies, usually pass the extra costs on to the consumer.
Yeah.
So actually, you, the buyer of the product, actually you end up kind of indirectly paying the tariff. Has that happened to American consumers?
Not yet, but then we wouldn't expect it to, for a couple of reasons. First of all, because we haven't seen the full scale of tariffs being unveiled till now, but also because it does take time for those who are involved along that supply chain to figure out who is going to pay that price and how they're going to pay it. Now, it's interesting to hear many companies, ones with deeper pockets, tend to say 10, 15%. There are probably ways we can absorb that within our supply chains rather than risk perhaps consumers not buying our stuff in America. So they may not see that whole thing passed on by any means.
Oh, so you can make some efficiencies.
You can make some efficiencies. But that's one side of it. The other side of it is that you've seen some of the makers of big brands, those who make trainers, for example, or household goods saying, we can now see how much this is going to cost us. And they're being more upfront about that. And what that tends to mean is that, we are basically priming shoppers to prepare for sticker shock on some level.
What's sticker shock?
Sticker shock I love the phrase sticker shock. It's an American thing, and it literally means those sharp-edged stickers. You go in one day, and this is the price. You go in and you go, how much? And I don't know. I mean, I was in the States recently, and I've got to say things are pretty pricey anyway.
Yeah.
And you think, well, the increase may not actually, in the overall scale of things, may not be that huge because Americans produce a lot of what they buy themselves. But even so, they are going to notice it on some sort of everyday items, and that is going to come through. Interestingly, it takes months. And some of the analysts we've been talking to say, if you look at how things have been sort of phased in and the kind of lags involved, Americans now say they're not that bothered about tariffs. However, they're going to notice this sometime next year, just ahead of the midterms. And that's when you're really going to see the reaction.
I was going to ask you a big philosophical question about, are we still in the middle of something, or have we arrived at the new world? And I think actually we have arrived at the new world, but the new world is uncertainty.
Yeah.
It's not like old world, period of uncertainty, new world.
No.
It's like the new world is the uncertainty.
It's not like you and I can pack up our tariff sort of crib sheet and go away and come back and when the next administration comes in. No, not at all. And I think what is interesting is we are now at a position whereby at the start of the year, the effective tariff on goods coming into America was 2%. It is now 15 to 17%. And we're not going back to the world that used to exist. This is a new page when it comes to global trade, when it comes to America's approach to global trade as well. I mean, things could get slightly easier from here. They could get slightly harder as well. But this is definitely, something new. This is not the end of it. These countries, by the way, most of them, which have been told these are your new tariff regimes, have been told they're not going to come in for another week. And in that time, you can try and have a chat if you like and see what we can do.
Right. So it could change again.
Could change again if you can get your foot around the door, which of course is not easy for many countries. But things could change again. And even those deals which have been done, there could be changes there. I mean, there are still things we don't know about with the UK deal, aren't there?
Oh, yeah, because it's not finalised.
It's not finalised yet. And there's bits like steel, the rest of it. And there are question marks over where this could go.
So interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's all we've got for you to watch on this episode of Newscast for today. From next Monday, our episodes are going to look slightly different because we're going to be doing them in front of a live audience at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. So next week's episodes of Newscast will come to you from Scotland with a live audience and plenty of interesting special guests and all the analysis of what's happening in the world that you love to watch. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye.